For Oberleutnant Werner Krause of the 352nd Artillery Regiment, the morning began like every other on the Normandy coast. A thin mist clung to the English Channel, smothering the world in grey silence. The air carried the familiar bite of salt and wet concrete. It was just after 5 a.m. on June 6, 1944. Another watch, another day of anxious waiting in a war that felt increasingly like a slow suffocation. He raised his Zeiss binoculars and scanned the horizon out of habit more than expectation. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the sea choppy but calm enough to see for miles. And then something changed. A dark smudge appeared, where water met sky. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, perhaps a low cloud bank rolling in from England. But the smudge didn't move like weather. It grew, it sharpened, it multiplied. Within minutes, the entire horizon had transformed into a solid wall of steel shapes. This wasn't a raiding party. This wasn't a diversionary force. This was the end of everything he had been told to believe. Before a single Allied boot touched the sand below, before the first shell screamed overhead, Oberleutnant Krause understood with terrible clarity that the war was already lost. The mathematics of it were simply impossible to overcome. To understand the shock that paralyzed German defenders that morning, you have to step inside the mindset of Fortress Europe in the spring of 1944. For 4 years, the Nazi propaganda machine had sold the Atlantic Wall as an impenetrable barrier of concrete and steel. From Norway to Spain, German engineers had constructed bunkers, gun emplacements, and beach obstacles designed to hurl any invasion force back into the sea. The newsreels showed grim-faced soldiers manning massive coastal batteries. The message was clear. Come if you dare. We are ready. But Oberleutnant Krause knew the difference between propaganda and reality. At 34, he was a veteran of the Eastern Front, where he had seen firsthand how quickly confident armies could be ground into dust. He was pragmatic, observant, and deeply exhausted by a war that seemed to have no end. His battery of 105mm howitzers sat in concrete casements a few miles inland from what the Allies would soon call Omaha Beach. From his observation post, a reinforced bunker dug into the coastal bluffs. He had a commanding view of the sea and the long stretch of sand below. The truth about the Atlantic Wall was far less impressive than the propaganda suggested. The fortifications were a patchwork, not a wall. Many bunkers remained unfinished. Minefields had gaps wide enough to drive trucks through. The defensive line stretched over 2,400 miles of coastline. There were nowhere near enough troops to man it properly. General Erich Marx, commander of the 84th Corps, had to spread 5 divisions across a 400-kilometer front. The math was impossible from the start. Kraus's own unit, the 352nd Infantry Division, was considered one of the better formations in Normandy. But even this was a relative distinction. The division was a mixture of Eastern Front veterans like himself, teenage conscripts barely old enough to shave, and older reservists who should have been home with their families. They were brave men, certainly, dutiful soldiers who followed orders. But they were not the elite stormtroopers who had conquered France in 6 weeks back in 1940. They were defenders stretched thin across a coastline that seemed to grow longer with every passing month. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had been racing against time to strengthen the defenses. He understood what the High Command in Berlin refused to accept. If the Allies weren't thrown back into the sea within the first 24 hours, the war in the West would be lost. Allied air power would annihilate any German reinforcements trying to reach the coast. The first day was the only day that mattered. Rommel ordered millions of mines planted on the beaches. He had steel obstacles and wooden stakes driven into the sand to tear apart landing craft. The soldiers called them Rommel's asparagus, but even Rommel couldn't build a wall fast enough to stop what was coming. The Germans were also looking in the wrong direction. Intelligence was certain the main invasion would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point across the Channel. It was the logical choice, barely 20 miles from Dover to the French coast. That's where the 15th Army waited with the bulk of Germany's strength in the west. Normandy was considered a backwater, perhaps a target for diversionary raids, but never the main event. This was exactly what the Allies wanted them to believe. Operation Fortitude, one of the most elaborate deception campaigns in military history, had created an entirely fictional army group under General George Patton, complete with fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks, and dummy aircraft. German intelligence swallowed the deception whole. Even after the Normandy landings began, Hitler remained convinced that the real invasion was still coming at Calais. He refused to release the panzer reserves that might have driven the Allies back into the sea. On June 5th, the weather turned savage. A storm swept across the Channel with high winds and rough seas. The German Meteorological Service confidently predicted that invasion conditions would be impossible for at least several days. Senior officers took the opportunity to relax. Rommel himself left France to celebrate his wife's birthday in Germany. General Friedrich Dollmann, commander of the 7th Army, scheduled a war game in Rennes for the morning of June 6th. Many of his senior officers were traveling to attend. The storm, it seemed, had given them a reprieve. What the Germans didn't know was that Allied meteorologists had identified a brief window of acceptable weather. 36 hours of relative calm between two storm systems. It wasn't ideal. The seas would still be rough, but Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower made the agonizing decision to go. The largest invasion force in human history was already at sea, and there was no turning back. As Oberleutnant Krause stood in his bunker in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6th, the mood was routine. The storm had passed, but the sea remained choppy. No one expected anything unusual. He had just decided to hand over the watch to his relief when something caught his eye. A flicker of movement on the horizon. He raised his binoculars and focused. What he saw made his blood freeze. The horizon had come alive. Ships were emerging from the gray mist in numbers that defied comprehension. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. He swept his binoculars from left to right, searching for an end to the formation. There was none. The entire sea had transformed into a solid mass of vessels, stretching as far as he could see in every direction. He blinked hard and looked again. The image didn't change. It only grew clearer as the dawn light strengthened. He could make out the hulking silhouettes of battleships and cruisers. Swarms of destroyers circled them like wolves, and behind them, filling every gap, were landing craft of every conceivable size and shape. They were packed so tightly together that the sea itself seemed to have turned to steel. Krause grabbed the field telephone, his hands trembling. "This is Observation Post 7. I have visual contact with enemy ships in the Channel. Thousands of them. The entire horizon is covered. This is the invasion." The voice on the other end was skeptical. "Oberleutnant, our meteorological reports indicate invasion is impossible in current conditions. Are you certain of what you're seeing?" Krause felt a surge of frustration. "I am looking at the largest fleet in human history with my own eyes. Get me regimental headquarters immediately." The response from higher command was even more dismissive. Reports were trickling in from all along the coast, each one more unbelievable than the last. The sheer scale of what was happening exceeded anything German planners had imagined possible. Intelligence had estimated the Allies might assemble perhaps 3,000 vessels for an invasion. What was materializing in the Channel that morning was more than double that number. The official count would later be confirmed at 6,939 vessels from 8 different nations, 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 864 merchant vessels, 736 auxiliary craft. It was and remains the largest amphibious invasion force ever assembled in the history of warfare. To Oberleutnant Krauss, standing in his concrete bunker watching the impossible become real, it wasn't a statistic. It was a physical presence that seemed to bend the horizon under its weight. It was the announcement of a new kind of war, one that Germany had already lost. While Krauss was trying to convince his superiors that the world was ending, the German command structure was paralyzed by confusion. Reports of paratrooper landings had been coming in since midnight. Dummy parachutists rigged with firecrackers had been dropped across Normandy to simulate combat. Real airborne troops from the American 82nd and 101st Divisions and the British 6th Airborne Division were scattered across the countryside, many miles from their intended drop zones. German commanders assumed these scattered paratroopers were the main threat. Few were looking at the sea. Hitler was asleep at his mountain retreat in Bavaria. His staff knew better than to wake him with unconfirmed reports. Rommel was still in Germany, learning about the invasion from a morning phone call. The panzer divisions that might have counterattacked were held in reserve, waiting for authorization that would come hours too late. The German military machine, so feared for its precision and speed, had ground to a halt at the worst possible moment. Oberleutnant Krause didn't wait for orders that might never come. He shouted commands to his gun crews, rousing them from the stunned paralysis that had gripped everyone who saw the fleet. Shells were hauled up from the magazines. Rangefinders called out coordinates that seemed impossibly distant. The heavy barrels of the 105mm howitzers elevated slowly, pointing their noses toward the steel horizon. The order to engage finally came just before 6 a.m. fire. The ground shook as the first gun roared, then another and another. Shells screamed out over the water, trailing smoke across the gray sky. Tracked them through his binoculars, watching columns of water erupt among the distant ships. His men were good. They found their range quickly and began firing with disciplined precision. For a brief moment, it felt like a real battle. German coastal batteries up and down the Normandy coast were opening fire, sending shells arcing toward the invasion fleet. Here and there, hits were scored. Ships were damaged. Some would sink before the day was over. The defenders were fighting back, but the feeling was fleeting, because after every hit, after every splash of water and puff of smoke, the fleet simply kept coming. The gaps in the formation closed instantly. The endless lines of ships sailed forward without hesitation. For every vessel the German guns might damage, 100 more passed by untouched. Krauss felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. He was watching the mathematical reality of the war reveal itself in real time. His battery was a man with a bucket trying to empty the ocean. And then the ocean began firing back. The Allied battleships had been waiting for the German guns to reveal their positions. Now they turned their massive turrets toward the shore. The USS Texas carried 10 14-inch guns capable of throwing shells weighing over 1,500 pounds, more than 20 miles. The USS Arkansas, the oldest battleship in the fleet, trained its 12-inch batteries on targets she could barely see. British battleships, HMS Warspite and HMS Ramillies, joined the bombardment. Cruisers and destroyers added their fire. The first salvos arrived with a sound like tearing canvas, impossibly loud and growing louder. Then the earth itself seemed to explode. Geysers of dirt and concrete erupted across the bluffs. Shells designed to penetrate battleship armor were now slamming into earthen fortifications. The systematic industrial process of erasing the Atlantic Wall had begun. Krauss pressed himself against the concrete as his bunker shuddered from near misses. Dust rained from the ceiling. The telephone lines went dead. Through the observation slit, he could see German positions disappearing in clouds of smoke and debris. Strong points that had taken months to build were being demolished in minutes. But where was the German response? Where were the panzers that were supposed to counterattack and drive the invaders into the sea? Where was the Luftwaffe? Krauss scanned the sky and saw nothing but Allied aircraft, fighters, bombers, transports. They filled the air in numbers as overwhelming as the ships below. The Luftwaffe, the once feared German air force that had terrorized Europe, was nowhere to be seen. The numbers told the story of a catastrophe. On D-Day, Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe managed approximately 300. For every German plane in the sky, there were more than 40 Allied aircraft hunting it. The few German fighters that did take off were swarmed and destroyed before they could reach the beaches. 2 Luftwaffe pilots, just 2, managed to strafe the landing beaches that morning. It was a gesture so futile, it bordered on suicide. The Panzer divisions fared no better. The 21st Panzer Division, the closest armored unit to the beaches, was tangled in confusion and contradictory orders. It needed authorization from Hitler's headquarters to move, and that authorization was delayed by hours. When the panzers finally rolled toward the coast, they did so without air cover, under a sky owned entirely by the enemy. Allied fighter-bombers descended on the columns like hawks. Tanks were destroyed before they fired a single shot. Trucks burned on the roadside. The counterattack that might have changed history never reached the battlefield. As the naval bombardment reached its peak, something shifted in Krauss's mind. The tactical part of his brain, the part that calculated ranges and called adjustments, simply shut down. It was replaced by a cold, terrible clarity. He was no longer seeing ships and soldiers. He was seeing the system that had produced them. Through his binoculars, he looked past the warships and saw in his mind the assembly lines of America. The factories of Detroit churning out trucks and tanks on a scale that Germany could only dream of. The shipyards working around the clock to build landing craft faster than German U-boats could sink them. The oil fields and steel mills and aluminum smelters that fed an industrial machine of unimaginable size. The numbers were devastating when you knew them. The United States alone would produce over 49,000 Sherman tanks by the end of the war. Germany, with all its vaunted engineering, built approximately 1,300 Tiger tanks. The Tiger was technically superior, feared by Allied tankers who knew their Shermans couldn't match it in a fair fight. But war is never fair. For every Tiger that rolled off the production line, the Americans were building nearly 40 Shermans. When a Tiger was destroyed, it was an irreplaceable loss. When a Sherman was knocked out, 3 more were waiting to take its place. The cost disparity was equally staggering. A single Tiger tank cost roughly 250,000 Reichsmarks to produce. It was a precision weapon, hand-built by skilled craftsmen, demanding rare materials and countless man-hours. A Sherman cost a fraction of that and could be assembled by workers who had been making automobiles just months before. The Germans had built a masterpiece. The Americans had built a factory. Krauss thought about the propaganda posters he had seen, the speeches about German willpower overcoming all obstacles, the unshakable faith in final victory. It was all a lie. Not just a political lie, but a mathematical one. Ideology couldn't stop a bomber. Willpower couldn't sink a battleship. The war would not be decided by bravery or sacrifice. It would be decided by production capacity, and that contest was already over. The German High Command must have known. They must have seen the production charts, the intelligence reports on Allied manufacturing, yet they had sent millions of men to fight a war that was mathematically impossible to win. Krauss felt something beyond despair. He felt betrayed. As the bombardment continued, the first waves of landing craft approached the beaches. Krauss watched the drama unfold through smoke and dust. The flat-bottomed Higgins boats dropped their ramps, disgorging American soldiers into the churning surf. The machine guns in the German pillboxes opened fire immediately, raking the exposed men with murderous precision. For the defenders of Omaha Beach, the next few hours were a glimpse of what might have been. The 352nd Infantry Division was in exactly the right place, defending exactly the right terrain. The American forces landing in their sector had expected to face a single regiment of second-rate troops. Instead, they met a full-strength division that had been drilling for this moment for months. The slaughter was horrific. Soldiers were cut down in the water before they reached the sand. Landing craft hung up on obstacles and became death traps. Tanks fitted with flotation screens sank in the heavy seas, drowning their crews. Bodies piled up at the waterline. The first wave ceased to exist as a fighting force within minutes of hitting the beach. For a few hours, it seemed the defense might hold. General Omar Bradley, watching from offshore, seriously considered evacuating the beach entirely. The American assault was pinned down, bleeding out at the water's edge. If this moment could have been frozen, if the battle could have ended here, the Atlantic Wall might have earned its fearsome reputation. But the moment couldn't be frozen, because the industrial equation was still running. The Allied destroyers, seeing the massacre on the beach, did something that naval doctrine considered suicidal. They abandoned their offshore positions and steamed directly toward the enemy guns. Some came so close their hulls scraped the sandbars. At ranges measured in hundreds of yards, they opened fire on the German bunkers with everything they had. Point-blank naval gunfire began systematically destroying the positions that were shredding the infantry. At the same time, new machines appeared on the battlefield. Amphibious trucks called DUKWs drove directly out of the ocean and onto the sand. Tanks fitted with massive chain flails crawled ashore, detonating mines in their path. Armored vehicles carrying bridges and fascines rolled forward to cross obstacles. These were Hobart's funnies, specialized equipment the British had developed specifically to crack the Atlantic Wall. The Germans had nothing like them and no answer for them. Slowly, impossibly, the tide began to turn. Small groups of survivors found gaps in the defenses and began pushing inland. Engineers cleared lanes through the obstacles. More troops landed, more vehicles, more supplies. The beach that had been a killing ground was becoming a foothold. By the end of the day, the 352nd Infantry Division had lost 20% of its fighting strength. Nearly 1,200 men were dead, wounded, or missing. They had inflicted terrible casualties on the Americans, over 2,000 on Omaha Beach alone. They had fought with courage and skill against overwhelming odds, and it had changed nothing. Because behind the first wave of invaders was a second wave, and behind that, a third, and behind the third, an entire army waiting in England. And behind the army, the factories. Always the factories, running day and night, producing more than Germany could ever hope to destroy. The Allies would land approximately 1,500 tanks on D-Day alone. More men and materiel arrived with every passing hour. By the end of June, over 850,000 troops would be ashore in Normandy, along with 148,000 vehicles and 570,000 tons of supplies. The bridgehead that had seemed so fragile on the morning of June 6th had become a flood that nothing could stop. The war in Normandy would continue for another 2 months. The fighting in the hedgerows would be some of the most brutal of the entire conflict. German defenders extracted a heavy price for every field and village. But the outcome was never in doubt after that first morning. Every German tank destroyed was a loss that couldn't be replaced. Every Allied tank lost was replaced by 3 more. Every German soldier who fell left a gap in the line that grew wider with each passing day. For Oberleutnant Werner Krauss, the rest of the war was an epilogue. He survived D-Day, though many of his men did not. He fought on through the hedgerow country and the retreat across France, driven by duty, and the fear of what would happen to Germany in defeat. But the hope of victory was gone. It had vanished in the gray dawn of June 6th, when he looked through his binoculars and saw not just an invasion fleet, but the full weight of the industrial world bearing down on everything he had known. History often portrays the end of the Third Reich as a slow collapse culminating in the desperate street fighting of Berlin. But for the men who stood on the Atlantic Wall, the end came in a single moment of revelation. It was the moment they saw a fleet that filled the horizon, a sky black with enemy aircraft, and a force that wasn't just an army. It was the concentrated industrial might of the modern world, aimed directly at them. This was a new kind of war, not one decided in the hearts of soldiers, but on the assembly lines of factories thousands of miles away. The bravery of individual men still mattered, but it couldn't change the fundamental equation. Those who controlled production controlled the battlefield. Those who could build faster than their enemies could destroy would inevitably win. For one German artillery officer, peering through his binoculars at a sea that had turned to steel, June 6, 1944, wasn't the beginning of a battle. It was the morning he knew, with absolute certainty, that it was already over.